ourselves so.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Goodrum Show with me, Chris Goodrum. As per usual, a big thank you to everybody that watched last week's episode of the show, commented and all that sort of stuff. An obvious apology for the rendering issues of the first video, and a big thank you to Andy for pointing out the fact that it was a little bit on the blurred side. Like I said, I think I'd been overdoing the soft filter, shall we say. So anyway, re-rendered up on the website, so all sorted in the end. Also, a big thank you to you guys that sort of like have been delving into the archive. I mean, had a nice message from WT who'd watched episode 10, which featured Yoshi and Miyagiku 12-year-old back when A, they were available, and B, they were actually a relatively good price, unlike today where they're stupid money. And it just kind of got me sort of thinking, watching or re-watching part of that episode and thinking, God, should we say, wouldn't say it was uncomfortable in front of the camera, but there was certainly a lot more business. Not to say that I don't go an awful lot these days either, but I'm certainly a lot more sort of comfortable with yapping away for half an hour or so in front of a camera. And I mean, even though back then I'd sort of done tasting evenings and events and things like that, when you do that you kind of get a bit of feedback from your audience, so you kind of like are kind of bouncing off them to a certain extent rather than just having to sort of like waffle for half an hour into a camera. These days I'm kind of quite more comfortable with doing it, but which kind of leads me nicely on to the fact that you've probably noticed that next week's episode of the show is actually quite a landmark, and I'm amazed that I've kind of got this far. I never expected to sort of hit almost 400 episodes of the show, and considering that I do a maximum of 50 odd per year, it's taken some graft, shall we say, to get to this point. But anyway, I have 3 possible episodes lined up to do next week, so you'll just have to wait and see as to which one I will actually do. But I can tell you now that whichever one I pick, that it's going to be a bit of a humdinger. I think so anyway. Certainly worth sort of like tuning in and watching, I think. But anyway, today's episode of the show, we'll put episode 400 to one side for now, because obviously we'll get there in due course next week. But this week again, I'm kind of following the sort of the pattern, I suppose, that the early episodes of the show for this year seem to be following, and that is looking at some samples that kind of came my way late last year, and today's episode of the show is no exception. These samples all came to me, I think it was in November of last year, so big thank you to Paul from Lady of the Glen for sending the samples back then. And like I said, I keep saying, I've got all these episodes of the show backed up, ready to go, and it's sort of, sometimes I just sort of stand here, looking at little groups of bottles that I've got stashed all over the place, thinking, God, what one do I fancy doing this week? I think this was a long overdue one. I mean, yes, I've done, I think this is now the 3rd episode of the show on Lady of the Glen's bottlings, ever since we kind of, got in touch and started working with each other. Well, working with her, that sounds highfalutin, doesn't it, as they say, but since I started buying from them, or they started kindly sending me samples on a regular basis, by and large, I think a lot of the stuff that they have bottled has been pretty good. Like pretty much every other independent bottling company. That some of them have been exceptional, some average, and the odd one or two, and maybe not quite up to scratch. But it's par for the course when you're an independent bottling company. And I think hopefully the previous episodes of the show have done, and feedback that I've kind of given has hopefully been useful, or maybe they just thought, well, you don't know what the hell he's talking about, but we'll humour the sod anyway. I don't know. I must admit, I suppose when you are being sort of slightly critical about certain things, that's probably more likely the sort of the language that would get used at one's review, I would imagine, or probably even bluer. But anyway, like I say, I always like to be objective. You know that if you send me samples, that you will get an honest and critical opinion. No axe to grind. I mean, obviously the show that I do now is obviously not linked to my work. I mean, the opinions that I express here are not necessarily the opinions of the company, but obviously we're always going to be interlinked, because if I like something, I can buy it and I can sell it to you guys, and so this is a sort of, and again, an exercise, I suppose, in selling as much as anything else, but it's also about sort of promoting the brands that I look at and review and all that kind of stuff, because at the end of the day, there's probably no such thing as a bad review, really, is there? Well, there is, but you know what I mean. What they say, all advertising is good advertising, or something like that. So even when I'm sort of, being slightly sort of less enthusiastic, shall we say, about certain bottlings, again, it's just my personal opinion. You may well taste something and think, well, that's absolutely stunning. He doesn't really know what he's talking about. And well, that's the wonderful world of whiskey, isn't it? But anyway, I think that's enough waffling for today. So let's just take a look at today's lineup. Right, okay, so we're going to kick off with a 5-year-old Linkwood. Now, you probably see from the title picture that there isn't a picture of this bottle because I couldn't find one. I don't even know if it's actually been bottled. I mean, it's got a proper sample label, and it was distilled in 2014. I'm assuming it was bottled last year, which would, I mean, given the fact that it's 5 years old, I mean, like I said, I'm guessing, bottled at, nothing like starting with a nice light one, is there, 60.9%. It's a single bourbon cask number 311288A, and like I said, I haven't got a clue whether it's been bottled or not. Probably should have asked Paul, I suppose, but these things tend to happen quickly, and anyway, if I knew everything, I'd be, well, anyway. The next bottle we'll be looking at was bottled in January of last year. This was one of their Q1 releases that I never got to taste at the time, but they subsequently got me a sample. It's a 14-year-old Aberfeldy. It was distilled in May of 2005, bottled, like I said, January of last year, at 56.8%. It's a single bourbon hoggy, 304420. And you don't see much Aberfeldy about in the independents these days, so it was quite a surprise to sort of like this sample appeared. And I mean, as we well know, Aberfeldy, owned by Dewars, pretty much most of the, if not all of the production, ends up in the Dewars blends. Yeah, used to be more. Used to see a little bit more of it in the independents. Certainly, the old Connoisseur's Choice range by Gordon MacPhail, the Aberfeldy in their 46% range was, along with, I think, Glen Elgin and I forget the other one, I think it was Royal Brackla actually, were probably the most sort of consistent bottlings that they did in that particular range. And I would, generally speaking, have no qualms if the vintage date changed. I'd carry on stocking it because they were by and large pretty much good all the time. But anyway, we're not talking about MacPhails, we're talking about Lady of the Glen. So 14-year-old Aberfeldy. Bottling number 3 we'll be looking at, it's a bit of a jump in age statement. This is a 22-year-old Auchentoshan. It was distilled in February of 1998, bottled in October 2020. Another refill bourbon barrel, number 10157, bottled at 56%. Then we're going to move on to another 22-year-old. This was a Glen Grant. It's a refill sherry butt this time, but looking at the colour of it, you would have thought not. But anyway, so it's a refill sherry butt. number 13212, distilled in June of 1998, bottled in October of 2020, and bottled at 55.1%. And for those of you that were there on the Christmas whisky evening, that was one of the ones that was on the list. Talking of which, leads me into this month's whisky evening, which is on the 24th of February. It was unanimously, I can't say the word, unanimously, everybody decided that they wanted to do an Irish episode of the show, tasting evening. So we're doing an Irish tasting evening, obviously. Tickets are available on the website. Obviously, you know, it's a virtual one. We do it via Zoom, and so, you know, if you're a little bit further afield than Nottingham, obviously you can purchase the tickets, and we can post out the samples to you. So, you know, if you fancy a bit of the Irish at the end of February, then get yourself a ticket. Anyway. The last bottle of this today that we're looking at is a Glen Lossie. This is a 10-year-old Glen Lossie. It was distilled in October of 2010, bottled in November 2020. It spent 8 years of its life in a bourbon hogshead and 2 years finishing in a profiler barrique. I don't know what the hell a profiler barrique is. I know what a barrique is a wine barrique. It's a wine cask. Apparently it came from the J. Dias cooperage in Portugal. So one imagines that it held Portuguese wine prior to sort of finishing Glen Lossie in it. So the cask number is 8647. So that's today's lineup. Let's kick off with a bit of young Linkwood then.
My face looks so
right, okay, so let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Young, fresh, gristy, bit of waxy barley, bit of apricot, a little bit of honey, wonderfully fruity, pear, peach, you know, white fruits. There's a little bit of grass, a little bit of gooseberry. That's an absolutely delightful nose. I mean, yes, you can smell the fact that it's 60-odd%, but it's not overly spirity. It's not too intrusive. There's not a huge amount of oak. Obviously, not expecting that from a spirit of this youth. But there's a little bit in the background, a little bit of a toastiness. Yeah, nothing wrong with this whatsoever. You know, really nice nose. See what the pulse like. You can taste the alcohol. That leaves you in no doubt that that's 60%. Yeah. It's a lovely palate. I mean, even though it's masked and my mouth is just watering, just like tap. It has a delightful sort of waxy barley, white fruits, apricot, peach, touch of honey, a little bit of barley. I mean, again, you know, classic, fresh, crisp Linkwood. I'm still trying to recover from that. My God, it can be on the floor by the time I get to the end of this little lot. I'm going to put a little drop of water with it to see what that does to it. Hopefully that will sort of open it out quite nicely. Yeah, I mean, it's got that slight bubblegummy kind of note to the nose, which I quite like in actual fact. I know a lot of people kind of like find that sort of characters a little bit over confected, but you know, I like it. I like that sort of estery, bubblegummy sort of sweet fruit, as long as it's balanced, as long as there's some minerality, which there is, and there's some you know, sort of lovely citric note as well, green citrus, sort of lime, and like I said, gooseberry, that kind of sort of note. There's a little bit of granulated sugar. It's just a really nice, harmoniously well balanced nose. Now, I've got no idea what this would retail for. because I had no idea what it cost, so or whether it's available, like I said. But you know, that's really nice. Let's see what it passes like now. Waxier, oilier, fuller, more barley, less estery fruits. It's got again that sort of nice citric edge to it. Again, a little bit of green fruit, a little bit of gooseberry, a little bit of lime. Lovely length. That sort of, you know, full waxy character. It just continues, and it's just a lovely malt at the end of the day. Right, okay, so let's move on to the 14-year-old Aberfeldy. Let's see what the nose gives on this end. Now, it's a bit tight. I mean, there's some lovely weighty fruit behind that tightness. There's some barley, a little bit of straw. It's a little bit fuller, a little bit more obviously mature than the Linkwood. There's a nice kind of vanilla note. There's some lovely sort of almost golden honey, and you sort of, if you kind of leave it sitting in the glass, the oak starts to sort of come through a little bit further, and I'm getting a little bit more buttery oak character. But it's a lovely whiskey. It's dense, malty. It's got lots of character, lots of personality. Good fruit, good balance of oak. Yeah, that's lovely. It's not available anymore. You can't get hold of it. I mean, I tried to buy some at the time and it's all gone. And not a surprise, really, given the quality of it. See what passes right. Quite tight again. Alcohol is certainly sort of giving it that edge to it. So it's less waxy, less full. There's more citrus, there's more white fruit, barley, grass, lime. Yeah, it certainly doesn't have the sort of the weight and the honeyed character and maltiness of the nose. The palate is keeping all that kind of under wraps. It's quite masked. It's got a lovely spiciness on the finish. Which is obviously alcohol enhanced. Touch of dried fruit, a little bit of oldish kind of oak right on the very end. Again, you know, really very, very impressive. I think it certainly needs a little drop of water, which I'm going to put with it and see what that does to it. Guess hopefully we'll just open it up like the last one. Okay, yep, softened the nose, brought forward the oak a little bit. It certainly brought out the honey, slight floral character, apricot, orange, less of the sort of more tartar citric notes. Obviously the softening of the alcohol has kind of like softened that as well. I mean, that's a gorgeous nose, absolutely gorgeous. It's soft, it's fruity, it's full, it's just delightful. Again, balanced, but sort of, yeah, more into the sort of like the honey, sort of malty kind of end of the spectrum now that it's been diluted a little bit. Let's see what passes right. That's gorgeous. I mean, that really has kind of opened it up. It's not so tight, it's not so citric, it's more honey, malt, barley, fuller, richer, gorgeous length, absolutely beautiful. A little bit more floral as well, a little bit more oak, a little bit of butteriness right on the finish. Slight mentholated herbal note just creeps in on the aftertaste. I mean, that is just a delightful whiskey. It's really complex. It's juicy, it's fruity, it just ticks all the right boxes as far as I'm concerned. So yep, another great cask. Right, okay, so let's move on to the 22-year-old Auchentoshan. Let's see what nose gives on this one, shall we? That's a lovely mature nose. It's quite malty for a Toshan. It's quite sort of dense. Yes, there's a little bit of rose petal, not sort of Mari rose petal, but the Toshan-y rose petal. Quite a lot of oak coming through. Desiccated coconut I'm getting, sort of, real intense Bourbon-y oak in inverted commas. It kind of feels more first fill bourbon to be rather than refill, or it kind of certainly feels like it might have been finished in a first fill bourbon cask, because it's certainly very, very bourbon-y. Certainly when you kind of leave it. But you know what? I mean, that is a lovely nose. I mean, yeah, all right. It is skewed slightly more towards the oak. And there is that, you're going to have to love coconut if you're going to sort of look like this, because there is a lot of coconut. But, I'm getting that sort of, like I said, slightly rose petally, Toshan-y kind of character. And it always amazes me how well Toshan actually handles oak. It's a triple distilled spirit, it's light, it's airy, it's elegant, and you would have thought, stick it in first fill or virgin oak or whatever, and it's just going to get absolutely hammered. But it doesn't. It's just one of those kind of quirks, Let's see what the buzz's like. Now, you can see why the distillery sold off this cask, I guess. It doesn't really quite fit the mould of Toshan. It's quite robust. It's very malty for a Toshan. There's a lot of lovely mature sort of bruised baked apple, spice, cinnamon, bit of barley. Sweet oak, a lot of quite sweet oak comes through on the mid palate. It gets quite bourbon-y, but it's not sort of overly dominant. I'm getting citrus. I'm getting, obviously the alcohol is kind of helping the just give it that kind of bite to it, just to sort of like stop the oak becoming too overly obvious. There's a little bit of Turkish delight on the aftertaste, the distillery character kind of coming through finally. And tasting this, it certainly seems that it kind of plays into that kind of rule of thought that people seem to have, that distilleries often sell off casks that don't adhere to their vision of the distillery character, and yes, it is a bit different to, and this is the wonderful thing about the independents. They pick up these casks. Yes, you can tell it's Auchentoshan, you have that character, but it's different enough to sort of like say, well, it's worth 100 and something odd pounds a bottle, and indeed I thought it was worth that and purchased some, and indeed I think I have a couple left on the shelf, or one, or what have you. And it's a lovely bottling of Auchentoshan, just showing Auchentoshan in a slightly different guise to how you would get it from the distillery. Of course, as we well know, the distillery has this horrible tendency to smother it in sherry, and it's like you're going, all right, I know Toshan handles oak well, but dear God, nothing handles sort of mountains of sherry, Anyway, lovely, really nice.
I know that I'm so full of patience.
Okay, so moving on to the Glen Grant. So 22 years old and a refill sherry bar. Let's see what those is. That's kind of classic Glen Grant to me. I mean, it's sort of like, yeah, I know that sort of Captain Colonel what's his face that founded the distillery had twirly moustache and was typically Victorian and all that kind of thing, and it just whenever I taste Glen Grant, it's always kind of classic. It's upright. It's all very very nice. It's just absolute classic. It really is. It's got that lovely maturity, that sort of cognac-y kind of dried fruit. There's almond paste, apricot, oily barley, green gage, pear, subtle sherry, very, very subtle, little bit of dried fruit, little bit of spice. Kind of gets a little bit of sour fruit kind of coming through now. I'm getting lime, again, sort of like, you know, Speyside-y kind of green fruit. I mean, absolute classic, and it kind of went down pretty well at the Christmas tasting. There was some people that weren't quite so keen on it, and I think it was where it fell in the tasting. And like I said on the evening, it's really difficult to kind of like, you know, make sure that you get every whiskey in the right kind of order, and sometimes, you know, you kind of get it a bit wrong, and it can, you know, affect how you perceive a whiskey afterwards. And certainly, you know, if you're tasting it on kind of on its own, sometimes a whiskey it says more to you. Sometimes your palate is maybe a little bit jaded by the time you get to another whiskey, which is why you always tend to do, or why I always tend to put the peated whiskies towards the end, the more the sherried ones, the winey ones, all that kind of stuff. But I'll stand by my gut feeling on this, which was like, this was a stunning old Glen Grant. Not quite as oaky as some old Glen Grants, which is nice. And certainly, you know, the sherry is way subtle, which is another plus point. It's not a sherry monster in the slightest. Anyway, let's see what that's like. Oh God, that's gorgeous. I mean, you know, a refill sherry cask. How many times do I sort of How many times do I praise a refill sherry cask? I'm kind of having trouble speaking today. This is like, you know. Anyway, I mean, that is absolutely gorgeous. Oxidised, sort of baked apple, barley, mature oxidised fruit character, spicy. A little bit of cinnamon, a little bit of pepper, a little bit of oak, a little bit of dried fruit. You know, I mean, that is just stunning, absolutely stunning. Lovely citric note in the finish, really well balanced. Got a nice kind of grip on the finish. A little bit of sherry that kind of comes back. I mean, that is really complex. You know, it's got a lovely progression to it. It's kind of classic. It is just absolutely stunning. I mean, it really is. I mean, I love old Glen Grant. That just fits in sort of absolutely wonderfully. That is gorgeous, and I have a bottle of it left on the shelf. And you know, if you love your classic Speyside whiskies, then you need to buy a bottle of that. You need a bottle of that in your life. That's all I can say. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Glen Lossie. So, like I said, finished in a Portuguese wine barrique. Let's see what those give us. Wine, herbal, black fruit, chunky, dried fruit, herbal, almost sherried, really intense. Distillery character, not a hope in hell. I mean, you know, Glen Lossie, elegant, light, delicate, you know, and you're just going to shove it into a wine cask. Why? What is the point? You know full well that you've given 2 minutes in a bloody wine cask, that's just going to sort of like completely swamp the character of the distillery. I mean, there's. Okay, I mean, you know, as a wine cask finish, it's very clean. I mean, no off notes. There's a little bit of nuttiness from the American oak, a little bit of walnut, possibly pecan, that kind of thing. I mean, yeah, all right, I can get some spirit character. Well, no, I get some spirit. You know, it's kind of, and you kind of like think, well, why was this finished in a wine cask? Did it have no character in the first place? Yeah, I'm sort of being a bit cynical here, I guess, you know. It has to be said that there's, if you kind of like try and block out the winey kind of character, there isn't really an awful lot left there. I mean, there's some American oak, but there's no kind of Glen Lossie citric kind of character. It's all a bit kind of like, you know, well, could have been from anywhere at the end of the day. And I'm not going to say this is kind of like a heavy-handed finish, because there are going to be people that are going to love this, and no doubt they probably were. To me, it's just kind of, just yet another one of those kind of whiskies, you know. It just really doesn't say anything to me other than it's been finished in a wine cask. Anyway, let's see what passes like. Winey, toasty, black fruits. It's got that treacly kind of, almost kind of PX-y kind of tarriness to it, although there's a little bit more citrus. I mean, I'm guessing, well no, it's not really citrus, it's the alcohol that's kind of like sort of balancing up that sweetness of fruit and wininess. Again, no distillery character, absolutely zero, nothing, zip, nil, nada, as they say. It really is all just kind of like wine cask, and frankly it's kind of not very interesting. It's kind of like, well, you know, again, you wonder, you sort of like think, well, why have you taken Glen Lossie and finished it in a wine cask? You know that it's going to, and I don't get the feeling that it's rough spirit. I don't get the feeling that it's been covered up to hide some murkiness, because there's certainly no murkiness there. I'm guessing that the only reason it's been shoved into a wine cask is because it had no character. You know, it may well have been part of a batch that was bought and it was tasted and it was like, well, not a lot going on here really, is there? Let's shove it in a wine cask for a couple of years and see what happens. That's probably more likely what actually happened, I would guess. Anyway, let's put a little drop of water with it and just see if that kind of, because sometimes that does actually kind of like, you know, level off the finishing. Not really, it's still pretty herbal, it's still chunky, it's still winey. It's still, again, you know, pretty much all about the finishing cask. So that's right. Yeah, again, it's all about the finishing cask. It's winey, it's fruity, there's a little bit of an astringency to it now. There's a sort of almost rye-like herbalness to it. I mean, I guess if you were sort of like, you know, being really positive about it, you think, yeah, it's nice. It's a lovely, it's a lovely mouthful. It's a lovely drink. It kind of, you know, has lots of kind of, you know, wininess and all that kind of thing. But it just, to me, it just kind of lacks some balance. Yep, all right, okay. If you're going to sort of finish a whiskey in a wine cask or a sherry cask or something else, then it's all about the sort of the balancing act. And to be fair, I mean, you know, it's not a science. You know, you can, you know, you put it into your finishing cask. You sort of take a sample at 6 months. You think maybe not quite there. You take a sample at 12 months or whatever, and suddenly it's gone kind of like whoop, it's kind of gone over to the dark side, and you're thinking, ooh, bugger, need to do something with this. Let's bottle it, you know, quickly. And it's always sort of a bit of a gamble when you're finishing whiskey in other kind of casks, because you just really don't know. It's not like a case of sort of like, well, I know if I finish it for X number of months it's going to be at this point and yada yada yada. It doesn't work like that. It's a natural product. It kind of does what it's going to do, and if you have the luxury of being able to monitor it kind of almost like week to week and go, right, that's the point that we bottle it, then great. But I'm pretty certain that sort of most independents just really don't have that that kind of like ability to do so. So you are kind of like, to a certain extent, working on past knowledge of finishing cask and all that kind of stuff. But like I say, at the end of the day, I imagine plenty of people bought that because they loved it. But to me, it was probably the most disappointing, I guess, of the entire range. So yeah. Right, okay, so let's sum today's episode of the show up. Firstly, a big thank you to Lady of the Glen, to Paul and to the owner Gregor for kindly sending me the samples for today's episode of the show. I think hopefully that they will think, you've been kind of quite fair. I mean, on the whole, pretty damn good. I mean, like I said, this is the thing with independent bottling companies. It's sort of like, there's always going to be some high points and there's going to be some low points. I mean, the Linkwood I thought was absolutely delightful. It was kind of young, it was fresh, it was exuberant, it was citric, it was kind of just classic sort of Linkwood. There was a little bit of a waxiness to it as well. And for a 5-year-old spirit, I thought that was really kind of complex and just lovely. The Aberfeldy, well, I mean, that really ticked all of my boxes, like I said. I mean, Aberfeldy just produces such a lovely whiskey. It is, and this cask was just there. It was just absolutely gorgeous. The Toshan, like I said, little bit of a difference, and which is what I want from an independent bottling company. I like to see things that are, distilleries in a slightly different light, whether it's kind of like using different types of casks or whether it's a cask that's maybe not gone quite how the distillery would have liked. Glen Grant, I mean, absolutely stunning. Like I said, I have a bottle of that left and you really need to buy that because that is just absolutely damn good. And the Glen Lossie, I mean, okay, nothing wrong with it, no off notes, no nastiness, no grubbiness, etc, etc. The weakest in this particular sort of bunch of samples, purely because of the balance. The balance was skewed more towards the wine cask than it was to the distillery character. And you kind of like sit there and think, well, you knew what the hell that was going to happen because it's Glen Lossie, for God's sake. It's not like it's a Linkwood or a Mortlach or something with a bit more guts to it that will kind of like cope with it. It's an effete whiskey, for God's sake. You don't kind of handle it like that. But anyway, so this little tasting just absolutely encapsulates the independent bottling company to a T. Some stunning stuff that's just sort of like that's just a classic example of the distillery. Some stuff that's kind of like slightly left field from the distillery, and some stuff that's maybe not quite so great. So it sums it all up at the end of the day. So, but like I said, I think the Glen Grant and the Auchentoshan were just absolutely spot on, and I just had to buy it. I just had to put it on the shelf because I wanted to sell that. And at the end of the day, that's what it's all about. If it says something to me that I really need to to buy that, and I really need somebody like you guys to taste it and love it as much as I do, then I will buy it and I will push it and all that kind of stuff. If it's stuff that I don't think I really that keen on, then well, okay, that's for somebody else at the end of the day. Anyway, that's this week's episode of the show in the bag. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you will maybe purchase something. Until next week, and until the landmark episode of the show, good dramming and good afternoon.